Well, now we know. The notion that Australian jihadi terrorists merely suffer from mental illness and can be readily reformed and rehabilitated with the right treatment and exposure to moderate Islam, this widespread notion, I have to say it's very popular inside government, well, that's been exposed today as nothing more than a comforting illusion. The Lowy Institute has just released an in-depth study into 173 Australians who've been convicted of terrorist offences or who have travelled to fight in Syria. In short, the study shows that typical Australian jihadis have no mental health issues, show little remorse for their crimes and have poor prospects for rehabilitation. Not only are local terrorists not mentally ill, they're not victims of an unfair society either. The study found that 60% of them were second-generation migrants. Only 9% had a previous criminal record. In less than 10% of cases were mental health issues even accepted as a factor during sentencing. Less than 10% expressed contrition during their trial, and unsurprisingly, given their lack of remorse, less than 30% was said at their trial to have got good prospects of a subsequent normal life. There are two conclusions to be drawn from this study. The first is that the substantial sums being committed to so-called de-radicalisation programs are probably a gross waste of your money. Now, that doesn't entirely surprise me. Singaporean officials, and let's remember Singapore is probably the local friend of Australia with the longest and most relevant experience of Islamist terrorism, this official once told me that lengthy preventative detention is really the only good safeguard against terrorist recidivism. Now, the second conclusion, a sombre one, given that Singapore's detention methods won't be readily adopted here, is that monitoring returned and released jihadis is going to be a lengthy and expensive business with no sure prospects of further terrorist incidents being avoided. As well as those who have committed terrorist offences here, about 200 Australians went to the Middle East to join Islamic State. About 100 are thought to have been killed, but the rest are slowly making their way or trying to make their way back to Australia. A handful have been charged and others are being monitored, but many, it's likely, will go back on the streets in the misguided expectation that they've realised their mistake in taking arms up against our values. Today's Lowy report suggests that optimism can't be justified. Indeed, the analysis reinforces our experience from Afghanistan, where more than half of the 25 jihadis who came back to Australia after fighting against our soldiers were ultimately convicted of further terrorist offences here at home. So while the so-called Islamic State Caliphate has been destroyed in the Middle East, at least for the time being, it seems we certainly can't relax our vigilance against Islamist terrorism. According to the study's author, Roger Shanahan, Australian jihadis typically don't appear to have interacted or socialised much with the broader Muslim community, let alone with Sydney or Melbourne's non-Muslims. They largely seem to have lived in a social and cultural, if not physical, ghetto, consuming, says Shanahan, enormous amounts of social media featuring jihadist propaganda. At the heart of this, of course, is a very uncomfortable truth, and that's the persistence of this death to infidel mindset with much of Islam. Around the world, tens of millions of Muslims, if not more, who wouldn't dream of ever putting it into practice, nonetheless accept the notion that non-believers have no right to live. In some legal systems of some major Muslim countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, apostasy, which is renouncing the faith, is still punishable by death. Forget the millions still being thrown at these dubious de-radicalisation programs. It's more likely that decent Australians who happen to be Muslim can effect much more change by speaking up on this issue, and our authorities by cracking down.